Compared to Wuthering Waves 2.2, this first part of 2.4 is more of a setup for a bigger story than a standalone completed arc. And as a writer and storyteller, I talk about how certain storytelling elements are executed so that you, as someone from the audience, can know whether the story is easily understandable or not, and maybe explain why certain things do and don't feel right. This time, we're stepping into Septimont, and when we interact with the first few NPCs, I did notice a drastic difference in how they are presenting information, because you can speak to an average Septimontian during the main story and immediately get a sense of pride in personal strength and responsibility. So from that, you can tell the people they respect as leaders culminates around strength in both body and mind. What I, and I'm sure many people like when interacting with NPCs, is when they don't repeat information and they purely leak out their culture and everything they do, and everything they talk about. In Septimont, this might be the first time I'm actually engaged with an NPC in a new region for Wuthering Waves, because I see a lot of detail and work in the information they present, at least for the optional discussions you get from the main story. It's also nice to see some similarities in how an open-world video game approaches NPC writing compared to how I would approach it in a novel format, because you don't want to put too much emphasis on unimportant characters, which requires a certain balance and attempt at hiding coincidence. The best way to do that is to portray the average person as someone who cares about something, whether in their culture or something they want to share. And by making the characters passionate in either a positive or negative way, they will feel more alive and it will feel like they have agency rather than just being a mouthpiece for lore and world building. From a writing standpoint, whenever you want to introduce a new culture or tradition of a group of people that fits into storytelling, you need to really flesh out the details of the culture and region first before you allow the average character to act and speak as a representative of that region. So for the first few dialogues with an NPC being this culturally heavy, like when they talk about the Aegon, Arsinosa, and Augusta, it takes a lot of skill and understanding of human conversation to weave a new culture seamlessly into storytelling without making it feel like exposition or something that feels tacked on without effort. Let's take an example of meeting a stranger from a different culture, right? From basic first impressions, they obviously know you're not from around their culture, so they will speak generally to help you understand their lifestyle. If they start demanding expectations of you because you are an outcast, then they're just full of themselves and you would think it's strange and just walk away. Or if you're in a video game, it feels like exposition because they're listing things off a checklist. So even these small things matter, and it's nice to see the writers and translators properly execute a realistic interaction. And then there's the entire questline where we are solely focused on getting to the finals in the Aegon with Lupa. Back in 2.0, we more or less took a tour around the entire landmass of Raguna with a very thin plot and story. But this time in Septimont, I'm glad the writers didn't force the story into a tour and actually followed two characters, Lupa and Cardadia, in order to illustrate the mystery we needed to unravel. It gets straight to the point and is cohesive, which 2.0 didn't do. I've stated in my previous analyses that the writers needed to focus on presenting general information that gradually builds into specific information, which they actually did really well this time by presenting the culture of Septimont first so that we have a broad strokes understanding of what the region is about. Then, as we got closer to the end, we learned more about Lupa, Mia, the mystery, and the culture of Septimont revolving around the Aegon, Priestess, and Ephor. So overall, it's a really nice introduction to the region that ties a narrative along with it. For the climax of the story, the writers played around with the idea of parallel realities, so it is more challenging to execute. But they did a really good job of establishing it in a relatively short time on top of introducing us to a new culture with new characters. It was a different climax compared to the previous act in the Avenolium in that it was less emotional, so I wouldn't be surprised if people weren't as excited for this one. This time there was a buildup of intensity from seeing the characters switch as the fighting choreography progressed. And once it reached its peak of fighting intensity, it forces you to think about how it could be more intense. And then the entire screen decides to flip, which did make me feel a higher intensity, but I didn't know why. I didn't know that it was supposed to represent parallel realities, but once I reflected on the feeling, the composition and movement of the camera portrayed Rover and Cartathea as insignificant to the whims of fate. Even though we see both of them in two separate realities fighting at their maximum potential, we see them powerless against whatever confines them because they don't know that there is a greater force at play. It's almost like we're looking at it from Cristoforo's perspective, being entertained by the larger perspective that he has woven together for challenging Rover and Cardadia and showing off that this is what he's capable of. But what I'm saying about Cristoforo is just one way of interpreting this, and we haven't gotten solid evidence of his forte yet, so we don't know if this climax is directly related to him. But I will put my foot down and say that the climax has something to do with Rover and Cardadia being unaware of a greater fate that churns them into conflict. Stories with parallel realities usually get bogged down by very technical jargon, convoluted plotlines, inconsistent rules, and highly unlikely scenarios that make no sense. But through the entirety of Act 5, the writers never explicitly stated anything about parallel realities. Yet the idea still came across very clearly, which is a sign of good, well-paced, and skillful writing because they wanted you to feel the information. Okay, maybe they talked about parallel realities once, if you consider when Rover was reflecting on Cristoforo's forte and whether Septimont exists outside of reality or not. But even with that information, the idea of parallel realities was inconclusive at that point in the story because it was still a mystery. The other thing I saw an improvement in was how Rover took agency in solving the mystery by looking for clues and testing the limits of all the tools within his or her disposal. It wasn't a situation where Rover was acting like a hero and vandalizing the place with a savior complex, like with Mount Firmament and Black Shores. Instead, it was a methodical, reasonable, and grounded approach. Writing a character this way tells me the writers understand how people face challenges in their life and are able to translate it into fiction. On top of that, they also understand the perspective of the audience well because this time, they're not giving us a massive dump of information out of nowhere. Rather, they allow Rover to pause and reflect on what they just witnessed, then slowly take steps towards the truth as more information comes. And as we progress through the story, we are learning alongside Rover with flashbacks and perspective changes, and none of the information feels forced, which implies good pacing. All the information we're given is dropped down neatly and nicely at the right time, which takes a lot of planning and editing so that it doesn't spoil future plot points. This feeling of following Rover and knowing as much as Rover is something a lot of stories don't do well. You may have experienced a story where you know more than the main character and the story feels slow and unfulfilling. And it may be also a story where you know less than the main character and they're doing so many things to the point that you think they can get out of any situation. In both cases, you just feel unfulfilled and disconnected from the character. The only thing now that gives us a feeling of disconnection with the Rover is knowing about Cristoforo and his allegiance with the Fractsidus. So in storytelling, you don't want to create this disconnection unless you know what you're doing. It can be a useful technique for certain stories, but definitely not here, and the story would still work by having an extra layer of mystery with Phrolova's mysterious acquaintance. Once we got to the climax with Rover and Cardadia fighting side by side in two different realities, that's when it was fully established that yes, the mystery involves parallel realities, and up until this point, it was all implicit information until one dialogue at the end where Rover talked about experiencing overlapping worlds. And this climax and the entirety of Act 5 is a perfect example of show don't tell, by allowing us as the audience to feel the information intuitively. Proper showing in any form of storytelling is about creating the atmosphere so that when you walk into it, a certain feeling or piece of information blooms and rises within you. This allows receptive people from the audience to pick up the information they have the capacity to recognize by intuition, meaning everyone will get something different, and this is a very challenging thing to get right if you don't know what you're doing. In this case, it's like translating the concept of parallel realities into music, art, and storytelling. But for storytelling, it's about instilling the feeling of parallel realities by implication. This is a completely different skill set that many writers and non-writers just don't understand because most of the time, they just want to tell you everything by beating you in the head with dumps and dumps of information. True showing and true storytelling is what the writers and translators of Act 5 did really well. It's like they're teaching you their story and characters, which makes it very cohesive, beautiful, and effortless. But I won't say that Act 5 is the best way to understand parallel realities because this story is mostly using it as a mystery gimmick. What I will say is that the climax leaves the rest of the Septimont arc open-ended, so even as someone that understands the structure of stories, I can't make proper predictions, which is a good sign. This tells me that the writers know what they're doing and they're sort of asking the audience to trust their execution for the upcoming part 2. So after Act 5 ended and you've paid attention, you're likely interested in where the story is going to go because it feels incomplete. This feeling that the door has been opened for the story actually has a label you may know as the call to adventure in the hero's journey. The hero's journey is a deep psychological structure that exists in all humans, which is why we can recognize genuinely good stories. The call to adventure is the second step of a story, and usually this is why a lot of people stop reading books and don't like a lot of stories, because you don't even have a vague idea of where a story is going to go. It's not because you're illiterate or you don't like something that other people like, but because the writers themselves don't even know where their story is going and they don't know how to execute it. Thankfully, the climax of Act 5 was executed properly with a known direction, so there's no issue. Other writers and storytellers may call the meeting with Phrolova the call to adventure because she's giving us the ultimatum of killing Lupa to prevent the Dark Tide in Septimont. But it wasn't impactful or paced properly, so the climax felt more like the call to adventure. If the writers were able to pace Lupa's character as a more integral part of Rover's journey, then I would agree that the ultimatum of killing her would feel more impactful, but that's not what happened. Then there's the first step of the hero's journey, the ordinary world, which is basically the setup section for any story. The ordinary world is important because it sets the baseline of what the writers will be working with. All the rules, players, and pieces that will be utilized for future twists and turns. In Act 5, we're learning about the culture of Septimont, 2 characters from the Fractsidus, and also the challenge Rover has to face in regards to Lupa and finding Cardathea in a parallel reality. The other thing about the ordinary world is that it's different for each character, because Rover comes from a different background compared to characters like Lupa and Mia. And what storytelling does is combine all these backgrounds and perspectives into a single ordinary world aimed at a common plot and character arc. From what the story has presented so far, I'm going to speculate that there is potentially a character arc for both Lupa and Mia, and the climax may revolve around Lupa's sense of loss, Mia's struggles of her past, and the arc of Rover and Cardathea potentially stopping the Fractsidus overseers in Septimont. Again, this is just speculation, and the story can go in the complete opposite direction with how open-ended the climax was. But going back to the ordinary world, it is the step in the story where characters are comfortable because the world is known and there's no mystery, at least until the call to adventure comes. The call to adventure is what breaks the rule of the ordinary world, and the writers did a really good job to show Mia flickering in and out in different contexts to instill mystery and a sense of supernatural. Quite literally that something is out of the ordinary. There are many ways to introduce the call to adventure, but for what they did with the climax of Act 5, it works and that's all that matters. Now let me talk about Lupa. She's the typical archetype of someone who is passionate in the context of her culture, meaning she exhibits what every Septimontian gladiator wants, glory in battle. But she also has a subtler side to her which seeks love and acceptance. Usually for fiery and passionate personalities like her, they portray themselves as larger than life to accommodate for their insecurities, which is something that also happens in real life and also something a lot of people can relate to and understand since you may be going through the same challenges. And if you remember from the beginning, she sniffs Rover, which is her way of assessing Rover's strength. This act fits her archetype well because it's unorthodox and helps convey her clinginess by getting into people's personal space. And then later, she's portrayed as enjoying the fights in a wild manner, and this unhinged ferality becomes a sort of excuse for her to feel the warmth of the people as a substitute for the neglect she has experienced in her childhood. Then, after the intense introduction, we see her immediately switch personalities as she gets angry towards Emilio because of betrayal and getting innocent lives entangled in whatever plan he was executing. She also talks about match fixing, which is a way to get predetermined results in sports through cheating to affect gambling results. And that sets a whole context around Lupa experiencing an unfair and cutthroat life that she had to get used to as she grew up in Septimont. Then we see her offer Rover to join her as a gladiator for the Great Aegon's finals, which sets up that she trusts Rover. Usually in real life, if you've gone through enough terrible stuff and learned to become a better person, you are a better judge of character and you can tell when someone has gone through similar challenges. So this entire exchange is highly efficient because it conveys so much information, not just through dialogue, but through body language, voice acting, and a lot of context clues. And for people who don't understand the subtext of why Lupa immediately trusts Rover, the following dialogues establishes her trust more concretely, but in the guise of taking revenge against House Silva. After the second fight and we bring up match fixing to Lupa again, she talks about how it's normal in Septimont, but listen to how the words are being spoken.
Honestly, I don't care what people say. This kind of thing happens every day in Septimont. If you can't handle it, you won't last.
This gives the impression of a resigned sadness, and beneath that, she suppresses her guilt for not having the power to do anything. And we continue to see the voice acting illustrate her powerlessness against tradition. At the same time, her experience tells us that she trusts people who are powerful, have integrity, and are responsible. She also doesn't like being betrayed, and again, there's a constant theme of desiring love and acceptance, but she's still driven by Septimontian culture to seek it through social status in the Great Aegon. And then you just see her sadness when she talks about the crowd leaving gladiators in the shadows when they can't be the paragon of strength. We also get some more nuances of Lupa's personality when she says she prefers watching recordings of Mia over popular gladiators like Augusta, which shows that she's not driven by trends and popularity and prefers having agency in her life. But she still has that Septimontian drive in her to achieve glory, which creates a nice conflict in her character and gives her some complexity that can be utilized later in the plot. I also really love this line because it completely recontextualizes her character, because you would think Lupa would look up to Augusta since both of them are strong. But instead, she looks up to Mia, who is a Ragunesi and someone who is unknown to us in this part of the story. It's these little well-paced dialogue sections that tells me the writers know what they're doing and know how to build a character. So once we finish eating and we go to the hotel, she suddenly trauma dumps on us, which is a strange thing in terms of pacing, but this strangeness can also be used as a technique if you know what you're doing. I could see a better way to word the dialogue here to make it more impactful, but suddenly saying something unprompted yet genuine is a good way to show that someone has a lot of baggage in their past that they might not want to say explicitly, but they say it anyway because they are comfortable around the person. Then the next morning, we participate in the Aegon and we have a moment where Lupa calls out Julia Silva after winning the semifinals for seemingly tampering with her spear to attack Rover. We are told by Rover that the frequency from the spear feels like the dark tide in the Avenolium, but we also have to consider that Lupa may not be telling the truth with the mystery resonator going on. So in the moment that Lupa blames Julia, she doesn't have much evidence to back her accusation. And since we don't know much about Lupa except our shallow trust in her, this sets up a situation where Lupa acts impulsively on her emotions that could lead to a tragic character arc if she was wrong in her assumption. But even with the information we have, we don't know who put the dark tide in her spear. We do know that Julia is very smug, but for unknown reasons. Maybe she just hates Lupa and pretends that she tampered with her spear. We don't know, and both Lupa and Julia could present their best argument and I would still not be convinced. In my 2.2 analysis, I briefly talked about what not to do when writing an argument, and this time they were able to execute an argument well. How? By introducing a larger perspective. You know. She holds the title of Priestess, which is Septimont's oracle. We're told by Lupa that Septimontians look up to her because she can foretell fate and has the final say in everything. This is a perfectly timed, paced, and planned storytelling where information is introduced as needed. We didn't know whether Lupa or Julia was right, and the discussion wouldn't go anywhere if both of them just continued arguing. So having a character as the oracle was perfect for the scene. She immediately declares Julia as guilty, although we still don't see any evidence about the spear, which creates a nice complexity in plot because the writers want to keep the frequency in the spear a mystery. Yet it also leaves Lupa's character arc incomplete because nothing is addressing whether she is right or wrong while acting out of impulse. And this incompleteness creates a sense of foreboding, implying that Lupa's arc is heavily directed towards a tragedy, which is in line with Cristoforo's forte and Phrolova's ominous foreshadowing. This altercation between Lupa, Julia, and Yuno is such a well-written scene because the writers wanted to create layers of implications. They wanted to introduce Yuno as someone with a larger perspective, they wanted to make Lupa's character arc directed towards a tragedy, they wanted to portray Julia as someone in the wrong but still make it feel like Lupa is losing something, they introduced another mystery element with Lupa's spear, They wanted a character that had something to do with fate who may be used later in the story. And these are just 5 layers of implications from the top of my head, which many writers can't do with a simple character introduction. This is also one of many mini-climaxes in the story which I have been asking for in my previous analyses, so it's nice to see it finally being executed. Now that I'm done with Lupa, let me talk about the villain writing. Usually with how villains like Phrolova and Cristoforo are written, they don't feel impactful because their dialogue is very general and grand, which makes it feel like they are speaking from delusion. I don't know the intentions of the writers when they write these lines, but if you want to make the Fractsidus more threatening, they need to appear when it truly matters to the characters and force them to make another decision, just as how Yuno appeared to sway the direction of Lupa and Julia. With the current way that Scar, Phrolova, and Cristoforo are appearing, it feels more like the writers are dipping their toes into the story and forcing a change in plot direction that's similar to a Deus Ex Machina where protagonists are getting plot armor, but this time it's for the antagonists. Usually when you write characters like this, you can make them perpetual villains so the plot can go on forever without the protagonist ever reaching them. This is usually the case with very long books, web novels, or long-running series because they involve improvisation. And to be blunt, this takes no skill and anyone can write like this even if you have no storytelling experience. Just think of Team Rocket and Pokemon or any equivalent story. But you do have to consider that Wuthering Waves is a live service game, so the writers need to have room to be flexible so they don't write themselves into dead ends, especially for writing an emotional story. A solution to this, which I'm sure they're doing, is to flesh out all the characters and make them as nuanced and detailed as possible so that the writers don't run out of challenges to throw at the rover. And whoever is doing the storytelling and directing needs to make sure there's no emotional regression and backtracking in terms of villains suddenly becoming weaker. And if possible, make sure we're not experiencing the same challenge over and over again as a player. If the writers want to keep the same villain writing style with its inconsequential ambiguity, then in the future they need to give us an overview of the Fractsidus' perspective with full character arcs to salvage these moments. Maybe they can show what Scar and Phrolova did in Huanglong and what Phrolova and Cristoforo did in Renacida. And if they continue to use the Fractsidus into New Federation and other continents, there needs to be entire flashback arcs for each of them. But that's just a hint or a suggestion on how to make everything cohesive without any retroactive continuity. I also want to talk about the villains individually, starting with Cristoforo. His archetype is prevalent in a lot of stories and it's also the easiest one to write. You see it in Cartor and a little bit in Julia Silva just in this act alone. This archetype entertains themselves with other people's misery and tragedy, while saying a lot of pretentious things that sort of strikes a balance between condescending but with nothing to back up their statements. Both Cristoforo and Cartor give a sense of mystery like you don't know what they're about. And this happens because they don't want to say anything about themselves that reveals who they truly are. So if you're addicted to mystery, you'll be stuck in that loop where you'll know nothing about them but feel drawn to it. This happens because they are afraid of people using their own qualities against them. If you listen to the voice acting, they do a good job of capturing that character because it feels like you want to attack and question them to get to know more. And storytelling-wise, this archetype is all talk and no action. If they do take action and they are actually competent, then usually they become the antagonist of the story. To explain the qualities of the archetype better, they are vengeful, petty, and will rub things in the characters' faces as a show of superiority to hide their own insecurities. It's a pretty one-dimensional archetype, which is why it's easy to write, but making them complex instead of the usual punching bag for the protagonist is challenging for a lot of writers. Why? Because this is the archetype of a narcissist, and you'll need to understand how narcissism is created if you want complexity and redemption. On one side, many writers don't care about redeeming this archetype. On the other side, there's people in the audience who are interested in Cristoforo because of his mysteriousness. And for people who don't know anything about writing and creating characters, this mysteriousness is actually a trap to get you to ask him about himself, which is a well-crafted mechanism for unaware people to give him everything but get nothing in return. To understand redemption, this archetype is very superficial and focuses on a lot of peripheral things such as status, how he looks towards other people, and desires to portray himself as a good, stand-up person that doesn't want to take responsibility for any malicious act because he should be able to do anything. Cristoforo is the most extreme example because even though he does present himself as good, it's a veneer that allows you to see his malice, and the very moment you damage his toys, he will throw a tantrum. This archetype is crafted this way because they have experienced a lot of neglect about who they are, and usually they seek attention from the world with the last thing they were neglected by. In Cristoforo's case, he probably wanted to prove himself with playwriting, but ended up being neglected even when he did his best. And with his self-worth already plummeting, that was likely the last straw that awakened both his powers and exaggerated sense of self. We don't know if he was born with his forte or whether it was triggered, but from his archetype, that's what I'm going to assume about his backstory. So if someone like Rover becomes more powerful than him, he will throw a tantrum, have exaggerated and childish emotions because he's still looking for attention, and become melodramatic as a show of self-importance. But if we don't see Cristoforo throwing a tantrum yet, then we can safely assume that he still has a much bigger picture than Rover or whoever is challenging him. If the writers plan to redeem him, it can take a long time and may involve a Resonator's character arc like Rover, a Fractsidus member, or someone else entirely. With the way the story is going so far, the writers could just eliminate him or extend him as a villain. It's also too early to tell if there's going to be a redemption with the current information in Act 5. Of course, as the story progresses, that may change. Then we have Phrolova. She gives a sense of callousness and resignation towards inevitability, and her archetype usually centers around an extremely tragic and unstable past that molded her into who she is. You can tell this from her dialogue with how much she laces her words with objective facts and universal truths that makes it difficult to disagree with her. And this can only arise from a lot of terrible experiences in life that forced her to be meticulous. It's also no accident that her title is the Conductor, because usually with these kinds of characters and people, they desire absolute control. So far, we don't learn much about her as a character, so to fulfill her archetype as either a villain or ally, she'll need to drop a huge truth bomb that changes how we view the entire story and allows us, the rover, to understand her perspective. Currently, we don't have any visceral plot point that allows us to feel her impact as a character, so there's not really a setup other than her title as a conductor and potential plans to cause another lament by using the Fractsidus. She previously showed up after Jinshi's second awakening to do some observations on how a second awakening occurs. And she was also in Raguna to control echoes and observe how Cardathea became a resonator for both the Sentinel and Threnodian. So the story does give some subtle hints about wanting to achieve greater power either for herself or someone else. This shows she's definitely playing the long game and is all about being precise with her actions to gather information for her ultimate plan. I also want to point out that the writers did show very subtle hints of her and Cristoforo's characterization, because we see her say that Cristoforo only trusts what he sees and not what people say, which perfectly paints a picture of both their archetypes. Even if Cristoforo sees the characters in his play go through unexpected routes, it will feed his own sense of ego and superiority because he automatically assumes everything is a result of what he has planned. He is very self-absorbed and superficial, so it makes sense he only cares about the spectacle and not about what Phrolova says, even though she's more reasonable and says a lot more substance. This same dialogue also gives us an understanding of Phrolova, as if she sees more in him than he does of her. And since she wants absolute control, she must know everything and use everything as a tool, including Cristoforo. So even if he thinks everything goes according to his plan, it's actually Phrolova pulling the strings. Back to storytelling, Phrolova's archetype is very challenging to write because you also have to be meticulous as a writer, on top of having a large perspective of life. Otherwise, you can't distinguish between what's universal truth versus your beliefs and assumptions about life. If you want to redeem her, it's even more difficult than Cristoforo because you'll need to be able to construct her past with such precision by cornering her as a child in a very specific way that forces her to manipulate others. Usually, people don't have that kind of imagination unless you've experienced that kind of trauma yourself, because it's really easy to have a missing element in the story that makes her tragedy not compelling. But this is the case for any archetype with a traumatic past. The setup is very important, and a deep understanding of the archetype is needed if you want the traumas and transformations to feel genuine. And then there's Scar, who I will talk about because he did show up in the trailer for 2.4. Scar's archetype is usually the one that would be the most powerful villain or antagonist in any story. For this type of character, it again involves an extremely tragic past, usually involving manipulation and varying levels of torture, which fits his name and face. Similar to Phrolova, he speaks a lot of universal truths, but it's different from her in that his words are quite understandable while hers is very cryptic. You may remember in chapter 1 when he talked about the story of the Black Lamb, and if you actually listen to it, he says really reasonable things. That's because his archetype centers heavily around empathy and weaponizing empathy as his form of control. This type of villain is usually very fun to write because they can do anything. The reason they can do anything is because they've already experienced the worst, so they just take it out on everyone and they don't care how they go about their actions. But if you add the empathy in, then his actions become a precise weapon. Story-wise, Scar's archetype can do anything either to make or break the protagonist and those that are important to them. He can act, manipulate people, physically hurt people, and can basically use anything at his disposal to harm another person. He's similar to Phrolova in that both of them know their own capabilities and feel very grounded in reality, but also have the competence to execute anything they need to do, which is the complete opposite of Cristoforo, who is pretty much a megalomaniac. I would say Scar is the most challenging to write, especially if you don't understand how archetypes work. A lot of writers make his archetype inconsistent and it usually reverts back to a Julia Silva or Cristoforo, where he becomes a very reactive and emotional character. Scar is a much more mature archetype because you need to understand how empathy works and how hurting people actually works. And if you don't have empathy as a writer, you can easily write this character as a narcissist, which is the complete opposite of his character. The interesting thing about this archetype is there's not a single vengeful bone in his body. He will do whatever he wants at the right time with a specific goal in mind, which requires a writer who understands pacing and people. So to put it simply, very challenging to execute in storytelling, but highly rewarding when done right. And now my storytelling rating. From what they've presented so far, their writing compared to 2.2 has significantly improved. Like, this is what you would expect from a good anime or any story in general, even though the plot in Septimont starts off quite simple. Since I'm a writer, my storytelling rating is based on how much skill is needed to write this kind of story while still allowing it to be impactful to a relaxed and attentive audience. On a scale of 1 to 10, 1 is doing nothing right, 5 is having a single overarching climax, and 10 is doing everything right in terms of logic, emotions, and universal themes. I give Act 5 a 7 in terms of storytelling, which means it's perfectly paced and logically consistent. To compare it with my rating for previous acts, this is the highest rating I have given the story so far. If you want to know what my ratings mean, you can check the description. Majority of them are below a 5 purely because it lacked any actual effort in communication or storytelling. Both Act 4 and 5 of Chapter 2 have shown that the writers and translators are beginning to have direction and understand what they're doing in terms of dialogue delivery. Specifically in Act 5, there's a lot of information that's thrown at us, but the information that we needed to know is structured in the right places. And it's this structure and pacing that tells us what is important and what to remember. There's also no logical holes I could see from what was presented, and many things made sense to me besides the mystery that's supposed to be intentionally confusing. It was also easy to read and digest, which all stories should be. There were some parts that didn't have much pacing, like for our interaction with Phrolova and Kartor, but the writers may want it to be something we brush off and see as nonsense and hubris. And one issue in terms of character writing I'm constantly seeing is not making the characters important for the current story arc. A lot of writers and storytellers don't know how to make characters feel necessary and needed, so it's not just a Wuthering Waves thing. In Act 5 specifically, Phrolova says that to avert tragedy, we'll need to kill Lupa. But the decision didn't feel weighted because storytelling-wise, we hadn't developed a relationship with Lupa. A lot of writers and non-writers tend to think time is the factor for a relationship to form, but that's not true. Storytelling is all about creating meaning, so being cute, wonderful, and fun to hang out with doesn't give any meaning to the plot, only embellishes it. People can be attracted to Lupa's personality and visuals, and that's fine. So for people like me who write and look for the skill and execution in storytelling, the necessity of Lupa in Rover's world was completely absent. Fundamentally, for any relationship to happen in stories or in real life, both parties need something from each other and give something to each other so that they can reach something in their life path. Lupa needed us for the Great Aegon, but we only needed Lupa to find out where Cardothea is. It established a very thin thread of necessity, and her death wouldn't affect our quest to find Cardothea since Rover already had a frequency connection from Imperator's sacrifice. and the writers can use frequency as an excuse to get Rover out of any situation. For anyone interested in writing a story, whenever you want to make a character's death feel impactful, they must be important to the main character to such a point that their death would force the main character to go a different direction. If you want a real-life example, imagine someone important in your life that you spend a significant portion of your time with. If they pass away, half your day would feel like it's gone. It could also happen with betrayal, but whenever this happens, you may recognize this sensation as grief because momentum has been cut, and it feels like half of you is being torn off. This is the sensation you want to replicate as a storyteller, and it can only happen if empathy and skill has been delegated to make characters important and necessary for one another. Make it so that the plot and decision-making will feel completely different with and without the character. Once enough momentum has been built into a single direction with the character, then the implication of losing them would make the audience viscerally feel like the plot could go two ways. Doing this to both Act 4 and 5 and future stories would upgrade my storytelling rating to at least an 8, which means it has perfect emotional execution. But it does take significantly more skill, effort, time, and planning to execute perfectly. Anyways, that's how to make Phrolova's statement about killing Lupa be more impactful, by having Lupa be an absolute necessity for Rover's journey. This issue of relationship development was also missing in 2.2 with Cardidia, and was one of the reasons why I wasn't as emotional on the climax or any other emotional moment, which I covered in my 2.2 analysis. I'm not against cute and wholesome things happening, but if the writers can weave that into storytelling, that would take the story to a completely different level. So that's all I have, and I'm looking forward to how they will execute part 2.
Anyway, it's on me, no charge.